The engines roared like wild animals. One by one, the bikers pulled in, forming a tight circle around the parking lot. Leather jackets, steel chains, heavy boots hitting the ground with purpose. Inside the small roadside diner, conversation stopped. Steven Seagal sat alone near the window. No rush, no phone, no fear. A biker laughed loudly as he stepped off his motorcycle. "Look at this guy," he said, nodding toward Steven, sitting there like he owns the place. The others laughed. They thought intimidation was about numbers, about noise, about looking dangerous. Steven slowly took a sip of his coffee. The diner door slammed open. 5 bikers walked in, filling the room with arrogance and tension. Their leader removed his helmet and dropped it hard on Steven's table. "Move," he said. "This seat's not for you." People held their breath. Steven looked up calmly. "I'm almost finished," he replied quietly. That calm response irritated them more than shouting ever could. The leader leaned closer, his voice low and threatening. "You got a problem hearing, old man?" Steven's eyes didn't blink. "No," he said. "I just don't scare easily." The room went dead silent. A waitress froze near the counter. A man near the door slowly stepped back. The bikers exchanged looks, smiling. They thought they had him. One of them cracked his knuckles. Another blocked the exit. "This ends one way." The leader sneered. "You walking out scared, or not walking at all?" Steven stood up slowly, no sudden movements, no aggression, just calm. "You should leave," he said evenly, "before this turns into something you can't control." The bikers burst into laughter. To them, silence was weakness. Calm was fear, and respect was something you took by force. They had no idea. The man they were trying to intimidate had spent his life mastering control, discipline, and violence when necessary. And in the next few moments, they would learn the difference between loud power and real power. The diner felt smaller than it actually was. The air was thick with gasoline, leather, and ego. The 5 bikers stood like they owned the place. Boots planted wide, shoulders loose, eyes scanning for fear. To them, this wasn't a restaurant, it was territory. Steven Seagal stood near his table, calm and unhurried. No clenched fists, no raised voice. Just stillness. The biker leader circled him slowly, like a predator that thought the hunt was already over. "You know," the biker said, smirking, "places like this attract trouble. Old guys sitting alone usually don't last long." Steven didn't turn to face him right away. He picked up his coffee cup, placed it gently back on the table, and then looked at the man. "I came here to eat," he said, "not to impress anyone." That answer didn't sit well. One biker laughed loudly and slapped the counter. "Listen to him. Thinks he's special." Another stepped closer, invading Steven's space. "You don't look special," he said. "You look breakable." The waitress finally found her voice. "Please," she said nervously. "Just order or leave." The biker leader raised a hand without looking at her. "Stay out of this." Steven turned slightly toward the waitress. "Bring everyone their food," he said calmly. "No need for problems." The bikers looked at each other, confused. Who talks like that in a situation like this? The leader leaned in again, breath heavy with smoke. "You giving orders now?" Steven met his eyes. "I'm offering an exit," he said. "You should take it." That word exit felt like an insult. The leader's smile vanished. "You think because you're calm, you're in control," he snapped. "Control comes from fear." Steven shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "Fear comes from lack of control." Silence fell again. A man at the corner booth whispered to his wife, "This is going to get ugly." One biker moved toward the door, locking it. Another casually picked up a fork, bending it between his fingers. Intimidation, pressure, a test. Steven exhaled slowly. "I've seen men louder than you," he said. "They didn't last long." The leader scoffed. "You threatening us?" "No," Steven replied. "I'm warning you." The bikers laughed, but it wasn't confident anymore. It was sharp, forced. They expected shaking hands, sweat, begging. Instead, they got patience. The leader suddenly shoved Stephen's shoulder. "Sit down," he growled. Stephen didn't move. The shove echoed through the diner, but Stephen stood like stone. He looked down at the biker's hand still resting on his jacket. "Take your hand off me," Stephen said quietly. The biker hesitated, just for a second. That hesitation was noticed. One biker whispered, "Something's off about this guy." The leader clenched his jaw. "You scared now?" he barked, pushing harder. Stephen finally moved. Not fast. Not aggressive. He simply shifted his weight. The biker stumbled half a step forward, confused. Stephen leaned in close enough that only the leader could hear him. "You're standing too close," Stephen said calmly. "And you're about to make a decision you can't undo." The leader pulled back, anger flaring. "You don't scare me," he snapped. Stephen nodded. "That's the problem." Outside, engines idled. Inside, every breath was counted. Lines had been crossed, egos were locked, and everyone in the diner could feel it. The calm man in black wasn't trapped with the bikers. The bikers were trapped with him. The silence didn't break. It stretched, heavy, uncomfortable. The biker leader stepped back, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off doubt. He didn't like the way Stephen stood. Balanced, relaxed, unmoved. It felt wrong, like staring at a door that looked open but wasn't. "You talk too much," the leader snapped. "Sit down before you get hurt." Stephen didn't respond. He slowly glanced around the diner. The locked door, the blocked exit, the frightened faces. Then his eyes returned to the leader. "So this is how you feel strong?" Stephen asked calmly. 5 against 1. The leader laughed loud and sharp. "That's how the world works." Stephen nodded slightly. "Only for men who can't stand alone." That sentence hit harder than any punch. One biker lost patience and lunged forward, grabbing Stephen's jacket collar. Enough talk. Everything happened fast, but not rushed. Stephen's hand moved like water. He trapped the biker's wrist, twisted gently, and stepped half a pace sideways. The biker's momentum betrayed him. A sharp cry escaped his mouth as his grip broke. Stephen didn't throw him, didn't strike him. He simply let gravity teach the lesson. The biker crashed into a table, plates shattering across the floor. The room exploded with gasps. "What the hell?" someone shouted. The leader's face hardened. "Get him." 2 bikers rushed forward. Stephen exhaled. He stepped between them, redirecting one into the other with a subtle shoulder turn. Boots slipped on spilled coffee. Bodies collided. Chaos replaced confidence. Still, no rage on Stephen's face. Just focus. One biker swung wildly. Stephen raised his forearm, absorbing the impact, then applied pressure to the elbow joint. A sharp crack echoed. The biker screamed and dropped to his knees. The diner backed away in fear. The leader pulled a knife. Steel flashed under fluorescent lights. "Now you're dead," he growled. Stephen stopped moving completely. "You don't want to do that," he said quietly. The leader's hand shook. "You don't scare me." Stephen tilted his head slightly. "Then why are you shaking?" That hesitation cost him. Stephen stepped inside the knife's range, where it was useless. His hand clamped onto the biker's wrist, twisting until the blade clattered to the floor. In one smooth motion, Stephen pinned the leader against the counter. The knife slid away. The diner was dead silent again. Stephen leaned in. "I gave you chances," he said calmly. "You chose ego." The leader's eyes were wide now. "This isn't over," he hissed. Stephen released him and stepped back. "Oh, it's over," Stephen replied. "You just don't know it yet." The remaining bikers froze. No one moved. No one laughed anymore. The man they tried to intimidate hadn't raised his voice, hadn't thrown a punch in anger, hadn't lost control for even a second, and that terrified them more than violence ever could. Stephen adjusted his jacket. "Help your friends," he said, "and leave." Stephen's eyes lifted. They didn't hesitate again. As the bikers scrambled to help the injured, a low voice from the counter broke the silence. "I've seen fighters before," an old man said quietly. "That wasn't fighting." Stephen paused. The man continued. "That was mastery." Stephen didn't respond. He simply returned to his seat, picked up his untouched coffee, and took a slow sip. Outside, engines started, but this time they sounded uncertain. The intimidation had failed. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in that diner knew. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the bikers' realization that they had chosen the wrong man. No one spoke. Not because they were told to be quiet, but because they didn't know what to say. Broken plates lay scattered across the diner floor. Coffee dripped slowly from the edge of a table, each drop sounding louder than it should have. One biker groaned softly, holding his arm. Another leaned against a booth, breathing hard, eyes fixed on Stephen, like he was seeing a ghost. Seagal sat back down slowly, carefully. As if nothing extraordinary had just happened, that calm shook everyone more than the fight itself. The waitress stood frozen near the counter, tray still in her hands. Her knuckles were white. She looked at Stephen, then at the bikers, unsure of what reality she was in anymore. You want a refill?" she asked quietly. Stephen looked up and gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said. The normalcy of that moment broke something inside the room. People began to breathe again. A man near the window whispered, "I thought he was done for." Another replied softly, "So did they." The biker leader sat heavily on a stool, head lowered. The knife lay forgotten on the floor, kicked aside like it never mattered. His confidence had drained away, replaced by something unfamiliar, embarrassment. One biker muttered under his breath. He didn't even try. That was the worst part. Stephen hadn't tried to dominate them. He hadn't tried to prove anything. He had simply handled them. The waitress placed the coffee in front of Stephen with shaking hands. "On the house," she said quickly. Stephen met her eyes. "No," he replied calmly. "Charge me." That sentence carried weight. Respect isn't demanded. It's shown. Across the diner, an elderly man slowly stood up. His movements were stiff, deliberate. He walked past the bikers without looking at them and stopped a few steps from Stephen. "I served," the man said quietly. 30 years ago, Stephen nodded in acknowledgement. "I know what uncontrolled men look like," the old man continued. "And I know discipline when I see it." Stephen didn't respond. He didn't need to. The bikers watched this exchange in silence. The leader finally spoke. His voice rough. "You think you won?" Stephen glanced at him. "This was never about winning," he said. "It was about choice." The leader swallowed. Outside, police sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Not close, but coming. Someone must have called. The sound made the bikers shift uneasily. One of them whispered, "We should go." No one argued. They had lost more than a fight. They had lost face. As the bikers began helping each other toward the door, customers moved aside instinctively. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was disgust. The leader paused at the doorway and looked back at Stephen. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Stephen finished his coffee and stood. "Yes," he replied. "I did." The leader frowned. "Why?" Stephen stepped closer, his voice low but clear. "Because intimidation only survives when it's tolerated." The leader had no answer. The door swung open, letting daylight pour in. Engines outside were quieter now, controlled, careful. The bikers left without another word. When the door closed behind them, the diner felt larger. Safer people slowly returned to their seats. Conversations restarted, but in hushed tones. Everyone kept glancing at Stephen, not with curiosity anymore, but with something closer to respect. The waitress leaned over the counter and whispered to a coworker. "He didn't look dangerous." The coworker replied, "That's why he was." Stephen picked up his jacket. As he headed toward the door, the old man called out, "Son." Stephen turned. "Thank you," the man said simply. Stephen nodded once. Outside, sunlight reflected off the diner windows. The roar of engines faded into the distance. Inside, everyone knew one thing. They hadn't just witnessed a confrontation. They had witnessed the moment arrogance collapsed under the weight of quiet control. Stephen reached the door. His hand was just inches from the handle when a voice behind him spoke, calm, firm, and certain. "Stephen, is that really you?" He paused slowly. He turned around. The voice belonged to a man in his late 50s, sitting quietly in a corner booth. He wore a plain jacket, posture straight despite his age. There was something official about him. Not loud, not flashy, just composed. Stephen studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good to see you," Stephen said. The room leaned in without realizing it. The man stood up for a second. No one recognized him either. Then he spoke again, louder this time, not for Stephen, but for the room. "You people don't know who you just tested," he said. The bikers, still lingering near the door, froze. The man continued. "I spent 20 years training people to stay alive in situations like this, and every instructor I ever respected spoke the same name." He pointed gently towards Stephen. "Him," a murmur rippled through the diner. One customer whispered. "Wait, Steven Seagal." Another shook his head slowly. "No way," the man nodded. "Way." The biker leader's face drained of color. "You mean he started." "Yes," the man interrupted. "Martial artist, trainer, consultant. And more importantly," he added, "a man who doesn't fight unless there's no other option." The bikers exchanged looks. Everything clicked at once. The calm, the balance, the control. It wasn't confidence. It was experience. The leader stepped forward slowly, hands open now. "We didn't know," he said quietly. Stephen met his eyes. "That excuse only works," Stephen replied, "when respect is your default." Silence swallowed the diner again. The man from the booth walked closer. "I saw you give them chances," he said to Stephen. "You always do." Stephen shrugged slightly. "Everyone deserves a way out." The bikers looked down. One of them swallowed hard. "You could have really hurt us," he admitted. Stephen nodded. "Yes." That single word carried more weight than any threat. Police sirens grew louder now. Red and blue lights flashed briefly through the diner windows. The waitress stiffened. "Cops are coming." Stephen turned toward her. "That's fine." The biker leader panicked. "We're done here. We'll go." Stephen shook his head. "No," he said calmly. "You'll stay." The bikers froze. "Running doesn't fix what happened," Stephen continued. "Facing it does." The officers entered moments later, hands resting near their belts, eyes scanning the scene. "What happened here?" one asked. Before anyone else could speak, Stephen stepped forward. "I'll explain," he said. The officer looked at him, then paused. His posture changed. "Sir," the officer said carefully. Stephen nodded once. Recognition hit. "Yes," the officer said quickly. "I know who you are." The biker's last trace of arrogance vanished. The officer turned to them. "Gentlemen, you're lucky. Very lucky." Statements were taken. Witnesses spoke. The truth came out clean and clear. Stephen didn't exaggerate, didn't accuse. He told it exactly as it happened. That honesty mattered. As the officers prepared to leave, one of them quietly said to the biker leader, "You don't intimidate men like that." The leader nodded, ashamed. Before Stephen walked out, the old man from earlier spoke again. "Most people think power is loud," he said. Today, they learned otherwise. Stephen adjusted his jacket. "Learning," he replied, "is the point." Outside, the daylight felt different, clearer. The bikers stood silently near their motorcycles, not climbing on yet, just thinking. The leader finally spoke. "You didn't destroy us," he said. "You showed us." Stephen paused. "That's harder to forget," he replied. He walked away, and behind him, every single person in that diner understood something they hadn't before. They hadn't just met a famous man. They had encountered discipline, restraint, and authority in its purest form. The police cars pulled away slowly, their lights fading into the distance. Silence returned once more. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was reflective. Outside the diner, the bikers stood beside their motorcycles, helmets in hand. No engines roared now. No one joked. No one tried to look tough. They looked like men who had just woken up from a bad habit they didn't realize they had. Steven Seagal stood near his car, adjusting his jacket. The biker leader hesitated, then walked forward alone. Each step looked deliberate, measured. "Stephen," he said, voice low. "I owe you more than an apology." Stephen turned to face him. "You owe yourself change," he replied calmly. The leader nodded. "I've been using fear my whole life," he admitted. "Didn't even realize it anymore." Stephen studied him. "Fear is easy," he said. "Discipline is work." The leader swallowed. "You could have ruined us today." Stephen shook his head. "That wouldn't teach you anything." The other bikers slowly joined them, forming a loose semicircle. Not to intimidate this time, but to listen. One of them spoke quietly. "When you had us, why didn't you keep going?" Stephen looked at him. "Because power isn't proven by how much damage you cause," he said. "It's proven by how much damage you prevent." Those words landed hard. A younger biker clenched his jaw. "No one's ever said that to us." Stephen nodded. "That's why you're still learning it the hard way." A breeze passed through the parking lot, carrying the smell of fuel and dust. The diner door opened behind them. The waitress stepped out cautiously, then smiled when she saw the group standing peacefully. "You okay?" she asked Stephen. "I am," he replied. She looked at the bikers, then back at Stephen. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping it." Stephen gave a slight nod. The biker leader removed his leather jacket and folded it over his arm. "I won't pretend we'll change overnight," he said honestly. "But today something cracked." Stephen met his eyes. "That crack," he said, "is where responsibility enters." The leader extended his hand. It stayed there for a moment. Stephen looked at it, not suspicious, not impressed, just aware. Then he shook it firm, brief, respectful. The bikers watched closely. That handshake meant more than the fight ever could. An older customer from the diner stepped outside, leaning on a cane. "I saw the whole thing," he said. "You boys were given a gift." The leader nodded. "I know." The old man smiled faintly. "Don't waste it." Stephen turned toward his car. Before getting in, he paused and looked back at the bikers. "One last thing," he said. They straightened instinctively. "Strength isn't what you show strangers," Stephen continued. "It's what you practice when no one's watching." The engines started one by one, not loud, not aggressive, controlled. As the bikers rode off, they didn't surround the road anymore. They rode in a single line, disciplined, quiet. Inside the diner, people watched through the windows. "That's the calmest I've ever seen them," someone whispered. As he drove away, the road stretched open and empty ahead of him. No sirens, no applause, no recognition, just distance, just movement. Back at the diner, the waitress wiped down the counter where the knife had fallen earlier. She shook her head slowly. "All that noise," she muttered. And he ended it without raising his voice. The old man smiled. "That's the ones you remember." Smiles down the road, the biker leader slowed his bike and glanced in his mirror. He didn't see Stephen anymore. But he felt the lesson, and he knew one thing for certain. Intimidation had always made him feel powerful. But respect felt heavier, and far more real. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The diner looked ordinary again. But those who had witnessed the events of the day knew it was anything but ordinary. The bikers were gone, riding back onto the road, quieter, thoughtful, and humbled. What they thought was strength. The loud engines, the aggressive postures, the threats and intimidation had collapsed in front of a single man who didn't raise his voice once. That quiet control, that calm authority, had been more powerful than anything they could throw at him. Seagal walked away from the diner, adjusting his jacket. Every step was measured, every motion deliberate. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. The lesson had been delivered. That was enough. Strength isn't about being the loudest. It's not about numbers or intimidation. It's not about forcing respect from fear. Real strength is subtle. It's discipline, restraint, and awareness. It's control. Control over your reactions, control over your ego, control over when to act and when to hold back. The bikers had learned that the hard way. They had thought intimidation could make a man bend. They had misjudged him entirely. and that mistake would stay with them longer than any scar or bruise could. Stephen didn't gloat. He didn't yell. He simply walked with calm purpose, showing the power of quiet confidence. Inside the diner, the customers whispered to each other. The waitress shook her head in awe, still holding the coffee cup she had offered earlier. Even those who hadn't understood martial arts or training knew the impact. Respect had been earned in silence, in precise actions, not in noise or force. A man at the counter murmured to himself, "Power doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be real." And that was the lesson everyone witnessed. Power is quiet. Respect is earned. Fear is fleeting. The moral of this story is clear. You don't need to raise your voice to make people listen. You don't need to strike to make people understand. You don't need to intimidate to prove who you are. All you need is presence, clarity, and the discipline to act only when necessary. Those who try to dominate others through aggression, intimidation, or force are not strong. They are insecure. They are untrained in control. They are fearful of their own weakness. Real power is calm. Real strength is silent. Real respect doesn't come from threats. It comes from mastery. Steven Seagal's actions weren't about violence. They were about clarity. They were about showing that discipline, control, and wisdom outweigh arrogance, threats, and brute force every single time. As the bikers rode away, the lessons settled in. The world doesn't bend for the loudest. It bends for those who understand when to act and when to wait. So, wherever you are watching this story unfold, remember this. Fey strength isn't measured in noise. Fey respect isn't demanded, it's earned. Fey fear is temporary, but discipline lasts forever. And if you believe in this lesson, type respect first. If you've ever seen someone underestimate calm strength, share your story. Your voice matters. Walk through the world with quiet confidence, act with purpose. And remember, those who try to intimidate will always meet the man who doesn't flinch. Because real power doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It simply exists.